Doctors and nurses of Reddit, what was the creepiest last words you heard from a patient right before they died? I'm a nurse and was previously working at an assisted living community on the dementia Alzheimer's unit. My very favorite patient had been declining pretty steadily, so I was checking on him very frequently. We would have long chats and joke around with each other, but in the last 2 weeks of his life, he stopped talking completely and didn't really acknowledge conversation directed to him at all. I finished my medication rounds for the evening and went to see him before I left. I told him I was leaving for the night and that I'd see him the following day, and he looked at me in the eyes and smiled so genuinely and said, "You look like an angel." I thought it was so sweet because he had not seemed lucid in weeks. He died the next morning. It really messed with me. Nurse here had a patient come into the ER with shortness of breath. He started deteriorating in the ER, and then quite rapidly on the transport up to the ICU. We got him wheeled into his room, replaced the ER lines and tubes with our own, and transferred him from the transport stretcher to his ICU bed. He actually did most of the transfer himself. He didn't say anything, but just before he died, he pleasantly adjusted his own pillow, laid his head down, and then his eyes went blank. This man just made himself comfortable before laying down to die. I work in a cardiac ICU. We had a patient who had a pulmonary artery rupture, a rare but known complication of a Swan-Ganz catheter. One minute he was joking around with us, and the next bright red blood was spewing out of his mouth. His last words before he died were, "Why is this happening to me?" It still haunts me years later. I don't care that I'm not a nurse, but this was said by my dad to the nurse, so close enough. Backstory. Dad had MS. He'd had it since he was 18, diagnosed at 20, married my mom at 24, had me at 29, died 15 days short of 45. 6 months before that, he was put on hospice. He and Mom were discussing funeral arrangements, and my mom jokingly said, "You know, Tim, the best thing you could do would be to die on a Wednesday. That way we can have the body prepared on Thursday, the viewing on Friday, and the memorial on Saturday so more people could come." The morning we got the call it was time, my mom, 2 sisters, and I were about 5 minutes too late. After we said our goodbyes, the nurse pulled my mom aside and asked if that day had any significance. It's not even 6 a.m. yet, so Mom doesn't even know what day it is, much less if it's important. The nurse tells her it's May 21st. No, nothing is coming to mind. The nurse told her that the previous day he kept asking what day it was, and they'd tell him it was the 20th. He'd look irritated, but accept it. That morning, he asked what day it was, and they said, "It's Wednesday, May 21st. He smiled, squeezed his favorite nurse's hand, and was gone almost immediately. It was Memorial Day weekend, and we did just as he and Mom had planned. And despite many friends being out of town for the holiday, we had over 250 people show up at the memorial service, overflowing the tiny church more than it had ever been filled. To his dying day, he was trying to make things easier for our family. I miss him. I found one of my comfort measures only patients standing at the side of his bed. It surprised me because he had been mostly unresponsive during my shift. I helped him back into bed, and he asked me why all these people were in his room. He suddenly became quiet again, and I noticed he wasn't breathing. He was a DNR, so there wasn't anything to do to try and bring him back. Looking back, he may have been talking about me and the CNA that was helping him get back into bed, but who knows what or who he was seeing in the last minutes of his life. Still creeps me out a little when I think about it. Came into an early shift and was handed over a patient who'd been very anxious and had a panic attack overnight. He was anxious all morning, but OBS all fine, ECG fine, and so I just asked someone to sit with him and keep an eye on him / reassure him for me. He gets worse, really panicky, heavy breathing. He's on his side in the fetal position. Doctors will be in 10 minutes, so I tell him I'll get them to him as soon as they come in, but ask if he'll lie on his back for me to help his breathing. He tells me he won't make it until they get here, and that he won't face the other way. OBS still all fine at this point, but he's more agitated, so again, I suggest he move position for comfort, and that's when he says, "I won't make it until the doctors get here. If I turn to face the other way, I'll die. He repeated this a few times to me. He arrested literally as the doctors walked in, and he died on the side he'd been refusing to turn to. I'm convinced he knew. Not a doctor or nurse, but my grandfather was on hospice care at home, and for 2 days, he told us that he had to go with the little red-haired girl. We didn't know what he was talking about. When he died, we cleaned him up and called the hospice nurse on duty, who came right over. I happened to be the one to answer the door, and there she stood, 5'2" or so, with gorgeous blue eyes and the most beautiful red hair you've ever seen. I couldn't even manage hello, but my grandmother looked at me and said very cheerfully, "Please come in. He's been waiting for you." I actually have 3 that stick out in my mind. An 83-year-old woman that said, "My mom's here. Are we going?" She died a few minutes later. Another old lady said, "I think I'm going to die today." We took vitals, everything seemed fine. She was stable. She had a heart attack a couple hours later. Not her last words, but the last she ever said to me. The last one is definitely the creepiest. A nice old lady who told my CNA she wanted to wear all white. When asked why, she said, "The man in black is here." She looked in the corner of the room. The CNA looked, but there was no one there. That's when I came into the room. We asked her to describe what she was seeing, and she said, "Oh, he's in all black and he's got a top hat on." Then she whispered, "And his eyes are red," while her eyes moved across the room to directly behind the CNA, like she was watching him move closer to us. She died later that night, but it was unexpected. That room creeped me out for a long time after that. I'm working on my mother's eulogy for tomorrow's wake. I'm going into detail for anyone that is smoking because I think it's something you should reconsider. My mom was diagnosed with terminal lung and pancreatic cancer. Mass had developed around her vocal cords and made it hard for her to speak. She smoked all of her life, and it finally caught up with her. It attacked her quick. From the time she was diagnosed to the time she passed away, it was less than 2 weeks. First, she lost her voice. Then she had difficulty breathing, became weak. She couldn't walk too far, then she could only walk a little, then nothing at all. She had trouble eating. The night she died, I let her smoke her cigarette. Doctor said it didn't matter anymore. And my sister and I took Mom into her bed, and I knew, as did my sister, it was the last time. We spent a few hours with her, holding her, and I got up, lost it a bit, and my mom said, "Don't be sad!" loudly with all her might. I was fortunate to be with my mother at that time. She was due to have hospice that Monday, but she did not make it. Lung cancer kills quickly. I hope none of you have to deal with that. Consider it that next cigarette. It's just a matter of time. Well, enough preaching. My first code as a nurse was of a middle-aged mother who we think ended up having a brain bleed. I was trying to check her vitals and she was super agitated, and had been all day. She managed to bend her IV pole somehow. She was ripping her gown off and the sheets off the bed, and she'd yanked her heart monitor off. I was trying to start a blood transfusion, but needed to get her vitals beforehand, which was impossible because she wouldn't stay still long enough for any of it to read. I'd given her a sedative for what we thought was anxiety, and I was praying it would kick in soon. She kept grabbing my arm saying, "Come here. Look at me! Help me!" with fear in her eyes that I will never forget. I'm pretty sure I snapped back, "I'm trying!" which I of course wish was something comforting instead. Then she leaned back, her eyes got droopy, she shut her mouth, then snapped her eyes wide open, but totally glossed over. She took one last breath as a coworker was helping me when I called the code. I'm a CST, certified surgical tech, in a specialized area of surgery that sees mostly people who are up there in age. This is more of a general observation than a specific story about a patient, but more than once I've been one of the last people to see someone's loved one conscious or even alive. I never forget the ones that tell us about how they should have come in earlier or how they were scared and in a lot of pain before being put under by anesthesia. I have also experienced seemingly lower risk patients never open their eyes again. Always tell your loved ones how you feel. You never know if you may not see them again. Not a nurse or doctor, but my beloved grandpa was in the hospital, ill with pneumonia and sepsis. I thought he would recover. He was asking to see me and my family, so I went with my parents, my husband, and my 2 little boys. Grandpa couldn't talk, but he was lucid and watching TV in his room. He motioned for a pen and paper. He scribbled something on a scrap of paper and gave it to my oldest boy, who was about 12 at the time. It said, "I love you." When we were leaving the hospital, it hit me that Grandpa was saying goodbye, and I started to bawl like a baby. Grandpa had passed before I got home. He held on just to see me and my boys one more time. I still see him in my dreams, only he isn't the sick old man I'd known since my grandma died in 1977. He is about 40, in the prime of his life. He is healthy and strong, taking long, energetic strides across the front yard of the house he shared with my grandma for 45 years. I have never known him to look like that, and yet there he is, popping in to say hello. I'm a hospital chaplain. When I was a CPE intern, a greenhorn, I went to see a patient in the ICU who had 10 to 12 oranges on her table. We talked about oranges for about 20 minutes, and then she said, "Something's going to happen." I went to check on her the next day, and the nurse mentioned that she'd passed the previous night. I asked if anyone else had talked with her, and she said no. So the last conversation she had was about oranges with me. I kinda wish we talked about something else. However, the nurse said that was a worthy conversation that the patient wanted to talk about. It made me feel better. I was a hospice nurse for many years. Super gratifying job for a nurse, surprisingly. As a regular nurse, you are rarely offered thanks. Hospice nursing is an island unto itself. Mostly peaceful, lots of times sad, often a blessing. This is sad but also creepy, and I wouldn't believe it if I hadn't seen it. Had a 20-year-old kid gang member who was dying of primary liver cancer. Super unusual, aggressive, and terminal. He was angry at the universe. His family was there to comfort him, but he literally spit in their faces. Every ounce of energy he had left was angry and mean and ugly. His mom would beg him to lighten up and accept Jesus into his heart. He would swing at her and tell her to F herself. The family remained beside in hopes he would chill out at the end. His last days, hours, moments, he was angry. The family called me into the room and told me they thought he was going. He wasn't responding. Chain Stokes breaths, eyes glossy, and skin cold. The end was imminent. His lovely mother, in her dearest attempt, whispered him to go towards the light, to her Jesus. With his dying breath, he opened his eyes, looked at her, and said, "F your Jesus!" A second or two later, he slowly turned his head to the left and got the most horrific look on his face, as if he was looking at something we couldn't see. And horrified, like in a bad movie, his face contorted, and he screamed with his last breath, eyes wide, "Oh shit! Oh shit, oh no!" Then made a guttural noise and promptly fell back into the bed and died. Every family member was shaking and too frightened to speak. And I left the room and took 2 days off. I don't care if I never find out what he saw. I may have told this one before. This is how I remember it. It was years ago. I was a junior resident. I didn't know the patient all that well, but got called up to get her paperwork ready for discharge. She was an otherwise healthy 96 or so, had a palliative colon resection for cancer, something. I went to her room to do a last wound check and DC a JP drain, and she kept talking about how she was going home to Bill. Her son pointed out that she's usually mentally very sharp, but Bill was her husband who had died years ago. He reassured her, "No, Mom, Dad is gone. We're just going back to the house." She insisted. "No, I'm going to him. He came to see me this morning and said he's taking me home." Whatever, I guess. Son said she was otherwise at baseline. It was the first and only weird thing she said. Vitals and labs looked good, so we progressed along the DC pathway. Not even a few minutes later, the code blue got called to her room. She was don't code, so we didn't do anything, but it was like, what the actual fuck? I guess Bill really was coming for her. Her son was surprisingly okay with how this played out. This one chilled me for a while. Names changed to protect the innocent, and let's face it was like 10 years ago and I don't remember anyway. I was staying with my grandma on a cot next to her bed as she was actively passing. She didn't say much the last few days. I got off a shift at about 11 p.m., went home to say goodnight to the dog and girlfriend, and was up to her place by about 1. I felt like it may be the last night, so I just knelt down by her, told her how much I loved her and how it was going to be okay to go. It was her time, and she's been a wonderful matriarch to our family. I tried to stay awake, but drifted off after that. The CNA woke me around 4 a.m. to tell me she was gone. I alternate between guilt for falling asleep and being grateful to be there in general. Fluff ruled. I miss her. She didn't say anything to me, so not relevant to this post, I guess, but it feels good to write this for some reason. 4th year MD student here. Haven't heard too many creepy things. A lot of the patients that are close to the end aren't in great talking shape. Not all of them, but most from my experience. Creepiest thing, though. We had a guy in his early 70s who was just a train wreck of health problems. Normally, Occam's razor brings cause of death down to one worsening cause. This guy had metastatic melanoma, really bad multiple myeloma, lung cancer that had metastasized, 3 different cancers at the same time. He weighed maybe 80 pounds. Hear a code blue over the PA system and the whole team shows up. Chest compressions, epinephrine. We get a pulse back after 3 minutes or so. Guy's chest was destroyed by compressions. There was trouble getting a good line into the veins, so I think they drilled into his shin. Catastrophically painful if you're awake. Dude opens his eyes and looks around a bit, looks scared as hell, can't really speak or really move, but looked terrified. His nurse, standing in the corner for the whole time, pipes up, not sarcastically. He told me he was DNR, the family put the legal stuff in a folder on the chair. We pushed morphine and covered him up, redid his gown. I held his hand until the resident declared him. First death I ever saw. Dead people are cold. Just really, really cold. No one had ever told me that. Something somewhere went wrong and his computer file hadn't been updated. Only that nurse knew because he and the family had told her. I cannot, to this day, think or understand why she didn't scream at anybody showing up in the room not to touch him, or at least look for the folder with his living will in it. She and whoever, doctor, nurse, secretary, whoever that screwed up that charting mistake, should be raked over the coals. The family seemed pretty understanding of the mistake, but if they wanted a lawsuit, it would have been a deserved slam dunk. Never gonna forget the way he looked around, though. I hope he was disoriented. That would be a horrible reality to have on your mind as you moved on. On a lighter note, bumped into a kid from high school at the gas station years ago. We chatted for a couple minutes, and as he headed out, his last words to me were, "We're going to the titty bar." Died as the unrestrained passenger in a car crash that night. He and his buddies were trying to catch air in a car by going over some hump in the road. Crashed into a retaining wall. He was a nice dude. Can't write this without sobbing, but years ago, my grandma passed. She was stubborn as she could be, and the hospice nurse kept telling us, "It won't be long now. Anytime, anytime." So there were about 20 of us, her kids and grandkids, her 80-year-old sister, standing around the bed. It became quite uncomfortable, all of us just standing there holding hands, waiting. So finally I went over to her and whispered in her ear that I loved her, and it was okay for her to go. She and I were very, very close. After I did that, my mom did the same thing, and my grandma's sister. After another while, my mom said, "I remember a long time ago, she told me she figured she would hear 'I'll Fly Away,' her favorite hymn, as she entered heaven's gates." Everyone kind of chuckled, and my 80-year-old great-aunt a few minutes later softly started singing. "One glad morning when this life is over, I'll fly away to a home on God's celestial shore. I'll fly away." And without missing a beat, all of us joined in as best we could. We were all crying. I'll fly away, oh glory, I'll fly away. When I die, hallelujah, by and by, I'll fly away. At the end of the verse, of course, we were all just sobbing. Not 10 seconds later did her heart stop forever. She just needed some help to fly away. Never got to share that before. Thanks. Not final words, but action. I was a first-year med student at the time, and as part of our clinical rotations, they farmed us out to learn how to do history/physicals on whomever would agree to give up an hour of time to chat with somebody who clearly didn't know their arse from their elbow and wouldn't be able to help them with anything. So largely it was the chronics awaiting placement who agreed. I was interviewing an octogenarian status post-dynamic hip screw who was awaiting transfer to rehab. We were plodding through the checklist that comprised my review of systems at the time, when he stopped mid-sentence and looked over my shoulder towards the door, as though somebody had entered the room. I cast a quick glance to see who it was, but there was nobody there. I looked back, and his gaze was fixed and his mouth was quivering slightly. And then he died. Boom. 1 second talking and the next dead. Massive PE. Saddle embolus. I don't think I've ever seen somebody die so suddenly since. And I reflect on that look. The specter of death had been right there, hovering over my left shoulder. I still think about the look in his eyes. He saw it, and he knew. Grandfather died this year at 86. He was in Nashville in a hospital for pneumonia. I was working and was going to go down there the next day to see him. My mother called me and said he was passing soon and if I wanted to talk to him. I said yes, and this was the conversation verbatim. Me. Hey, Papa, it's Marky. How's it going? Grandfather. I'm sick. Me. Can you hang on for a few more hours and I'll be there? Grandfather. Nope, I'm out of here. Me. I love you. Grandfather. All right. He died before the phone hung up. Really bothered me with how accepting he was of his own death. I think about it every day. This guy was gobbling down his breakfast and was refusing to have his blood glucose checked. And we knew that he would need insulin because of his history. I expressed my concern and he told me, I have faced death many times before. He's nearly blind, missing a few digits, you get the picture. I came back 30 minutes later to check on him. He was unconscious and nearly turning blue. We coded him and recovered him to the ICU, basically brain dead. They pulled the plug on him a week later. Turned out, he had choked on a piece of egg from the breakfast he was eating. Maybe not a real creepy story.